I'm continuing on with the rear suspension overhaul on my Cagiva. This is one of the main linkages involved in the rear suspension that basically links the shock absorber to the swing arm. We've already punched out one of the bearings. We weren't confident that we could press it through and that it would actually push the other one out the other side. We thought we might have too much friction to deal with. So we put it on here, we got the punch in, we punched that bearing housing out, and the other one we're actually going to show you how to press it out. But before we do that, we thought we'd just give you a bit of a rundown on the different bearings you might find when you pull apart your suspension. That's a standard sort of needle roller bearing that has a cage inside, so all the little needles are held in place by a cage and can't fall out. This is another of the standard caged kind, but it's a double row, so there's actually two of those bearings in one almost. This is the most interesting one and also the most awkward to deal with. It's what's called a full complement bearing, which means there's no cage in there. So that little bearing there is actually capable of carrying a lot more load because you've got all the space in there taken up by rollers rather than having a cage, which the cage basically halves the number of rollers. What's awkward about these bearings is that when you're servicing them, the needles are prone to falling out. Pull your suspension apart and suddenly all these little needles fall on the floor everywhere. So preferably know what kind of bearings are in your suspension before you pull it apart, so you can be prepared for the fact that you might have these things fall out all over the place. You can catch them all and count them and make sure you put back in as many as came out. So with this linkage, we've pushed out one of the bearing housings already. All the needles have come out. We punched it out. What we'll show you how to do is sort of the more kosher, orthodox method of doing it, which is to actually press it out. Get a socket that's the right diameter and long enough that you can get at the bearing, push that in, put that in there, and you can use the pressure of the vise to push that socket in and push the bearing out. You actually use a socket that fits loosely enough that it's not going to wedge in there, and also that you just be a bit careful about any printing or anything like any stamping that's been done into the socket, that if you get it in far enough, sometimes there'll be burred edges on the printing that will actually can wedge in there or damage the surface inside where you're pressing and you might end up with the socket stuck in there. This is what I would call, what I always refer to as the receiving socket. So that'll be on the other side.
The female, maybe.
The female socket, yeah. You've got to make sure that this is big enough that the bearing will actually just drop out and fit inside it, your receiving socket or your female socket, and not end up with a bearing wedged inside a socket basically. It'd be the same procedure if you were dealing with one side of your swing arm fork as well, except you'd need probably a mate to hold the swing arm for you. I'm coming up against the linkage now, so just move it back. There we go. So there you go. We press that out. We've got a nice fresh bearing here. We can just press that in initially just using the soft jaws on the vise. Need to recess it a little bit further just so we can fit the seal on the outside. The dished side of them you want to be inwards. Yeah, they're more or less 3mm. So I'm just going to recess that bearing about 3mm.
Yeah, if you crank it. How are you going to know when 3mm is up?
Might be. Is it 3 cranks to the handle?
I doubt it.
That's probably about it, I'd say.
Let's check it out.
Yeah. Near enough.
3.1?
Yep, that'll do me.
Happy?
We'll just press the other one in the same way and then we'll do the seals. We've pushed them in 3mm recessed at either end to allow the seals to be put in. Here's the lovely shaft that Trent made me. When you go to push the shaft through, sometimes it picks up those needle rollers and they all get dislodged and pushed out the other side, and you just end up with a big blob of grease full of needle rollers. So what you can do is, if you can get a tube socket or some sort of shaft that's slightly smaller diameter than what you actually need to put in there, put it through, and then when you put your shaft in, basically push out that spacer that you've used, that socket or whatever that you've used as a spacer, that's essentially just there to hold the rollers in place. Just put a little bit of lubricant around the outside of these seals and on the inside of them as well. So there we go. That's ready to go back on the swing arm now. As I said, I might just put a bit more grease in either side. This is my swing arm that's been powder coated. It was anodised alloy, but the anodising had gone off. There's no real effective way you can re-anodise something, so I just decided to get it powder coated in a flat silver. This is one of the old bearings which I could have actually reused, and what you could probably do is just sit them down on the bench, get WD-40 and spray it in there and let it wash out all the crap that's in there. If you were servicing your swing arm, you could just leave the bearings in place, have a bit of a feel and go, oh yeah, they don't feel too bad. Have a look at the bush that goes in there and see whether it's scored or not, which might indicate that the bearings are worn and that they're jamming or that they're not fitting closely enough. And the way we're going to press the new ones in there, basically the same as what we just showed you with the linkage. We're now going to press in the swing arm pivot bearings, which are just a standard caged needle roller bearing. They don't carry as much load as the swing arm linkages, so you don't have to have the full complement bearing in there. A lot of people, when they fit bearings, will stick them in the freezer just to make them shrink down a little bit when they're an interference fit, or heat up the housing that they're going to press them into, or do both. I don't think it's really worth it in a case like this, because if you heated that and cooled this takes a little while to press in, and it's just going to take the heat from the swing arm and expand back out. You could put it in the freezer if you wanted, just put that in the freezer, maybe it would make some difference. It definitely can make a difference with the cups for steering head bearings, which you press in quite quickly so they don't have time to warm up if you get them straight out of the freezer. Just get this started, sit it in place, make sure I got it nice and lined up, and just very gently. Doesn't really look that square, does it?
No.
What do you reckon?
Yeah, I'll leave it. Yeah, there you go. There you go. That's it. Yeah, that's enough.
Yeah.
Push it against one of the drawers, and I'll do the vice up. No, you got it. You got it. Okay.
Because it's quite a long bearing, the further you press it in, there's more friction and more resistance. It doesn't kind of start off difficult and then get easier, but it shouldn't get so hard that you have to be swinging off the handle of the vice, otherwise you might find you've got some problems. I think the seal's about 4mm. There we go. Get it out and just check that the bearing is running freely, which it is. Not only should the little bearings themselves rotate, but the cage that they're in should rotate as well. We'll get that accurately pressed into the depth we need for the seal. Load your finger up with some good waterproof grease and just get in there and work as much of it into the bearing as you can. Here's the other bearing going in, bit of a different angle. So there we go, both sets of swing arm pivot bearings are in. I've done my linkage bearings as well, ready to go back on the bike, and I'm happy.